Hello, Motivation SIG. My name's Yin, and today I'll be interviewing Dr. Stacy Priniski, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Michigan State University. Her research focuses on using social psychological interventions based in motivational theory to reduce educational achievement gaps. And in 2018, Stacy received the highly prestigious Spencer Fellowship for her dissertation research on a utility value intervention in STEM. So therefore, she seemed like the perfect person to interview about fellowship funding. So thanks so much for being here, Stacy.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
So our first question for you is where do you hear about these fellowship opportunities, and when are these calls typically announced?
So for dissertation fellowships, deadlines are usually in the fall, but of course it's going to vary across funders. For something like the Spencer Fellowship, that's open every year. And so you can find information about it year round. And so when it opens is not particularly important because you can always find it, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of good places to find resources for finding fellowships. Some of the best ones are through professional organizations like AERA will often maintain lists of fellowships that may be of interest. Graduate programs often will. Graduate studies offices at your university are great places to go to ask about what kinds of fellowships are available. And of course, like your peers and your mentor as well are good people to ask. Other people who do research similar to you who may have gotten fellowships in the past are great people to ask what they applied for. As with most things, like if you just take advantage of your social networks, they often have really good information for you.
Okay, so our next question for you is, what was the most challenging part of getting your fellowship, and how did you overcome it or rise to meet that challenge?
So the biggest thing I think there's two. So the first one is just getting over the hurdle of deciding to apply. And I think the key is thinking about it as a learning opportunity. So like, it's a good idea to apply for fellowships, period. The experience of applying for one is a good experience to have regardless of whether you get it. So I wouldn't worry too much about finding the perfect one or worrying about whether or not you're likely to get it. I would just commit to applying to some because the process is really important. And even being able to tell people or put on your CV that you applied or that you made it into a list of finalists is a worthwhile thing. So that's like thing one, just decide to do it. And then the writing is different. It's a different audience. And so you have to talk about your research in a slightly different way than you would for like writing an empirical paper, for example. And so that's the second thing. The best advice that I have about that is, again, to leverage your networks. It's like find people who have applied for these things before, or ideally people who have gotten those fellowships, and ask them if they're willing to share their materials. There's a pretty rich tradition of that for something like the Spencer. I've had people I've never met before email me to ask me about applying for the Spencer, and I'm always happy to answer those questions. So like Spencer maintains a website that has a list of everyone who's gotten a fellowship over the last several years. And so you can just go through and see people who have done research in your field who have gotten a Spencer. You can literally cold email them and be like, hey, I want to apply for the Spencer. Do you have any advice for me? And the worst thing they can say is no. And in my experience, almost everyone says yes. The other thing that I would suggest is, so the thing that's different about the writing is that it's for a more general audience.
Okay.
So I would suggest getting a like wide range of people to read your materials and give you feedback, even people who don't know much about your research area.
So what are the resources that graduate students interested in fellowships, what would they find really helpful or valuable?
So I think a lot of the same places that I would go to get help finding fellowships are the same places that I would get help in thinking about how to get a fellowship. So places like your graduate studies office that work with grad students all the time who are applying for and receiving fellowships. Your social networks, of course, people who have gotten fellowships before are always good people to reach out to. And then like, again, just thinking about like who's in your village, who's in your community, who might have 10 minutes to give you some quick advice. Those are great people to leverage expertise from.
So we talked about how graduate or not grant writing or fellowship writing, writing for any kind of funding is different from academic writing in a way. And I know you spoke on this a little bit about, speaking to a more general audience. So do you have any other insight on like what are the big differences between your writing, or how did you approach writing in that way?
Yeah, so because the work that we do is relevant to education specifically, we sort of have a leg up on this skill set. We think all the time about the way that our research can be translated into the real world and why like your average person should care about what we do. That's the kind of writing that you do for a grant, right? If you think about the kinds of places you'll be applying to get fellowships from, AERA, for example, really cares about translation from research to education. Spencer is the exact same way. NSF, NIH, all of these funding resources are really going to care about how your research can make an actual impact in the world. Basic research for the sake of building knowledge, really important, and they respect that, but they want to know why the average person would care about your research. And that's the kind of writing that you do in a grant. So it's just like balancing, showing that you really understand basic research and statistics and how to design a study, but thinking more broadly and writing more accessibly about why your research is of broad interest. Like something like the Spencer, you might not get a reviewer that's in educational psychology or psychology. You might get people who do ed policy and ed history reading your proposal. So you have to be able to use sort of general audience language to talk about your research and why the average person should care about it.
Yeah, that's really
and like I said, like getting colleagues from different departments or just people who are good writers to take a look at your application and give you feedback on it can be a really good way to test how well you're doing at that general audience writing.
Okay, thank you so much for that. My next piece of advice, and it's sort of related, is if you have any specific advice for writing a personal statement or even a research plan statement.
Yes, so personal statements are really interesting. And in some ways, they're easier to write because you're just talking about yourself. And in other ways, that is one of the hardest things for us to do because we're not used to, like, even when you're writing about your research, you rarely use pronouns. You rarely talk about how you think or feel about your work. You're usually just saying, the researchers did this thing. So obviously, when you're applying for a research fellowship, who you are as a researcher is a really important part of that. But it's a chance to step out of sort of the details of your research and think about the story of your research. So like how you as a person came to be doing this work and how you as a person think about that work on sort of a broader level. So a lot of personal statements, you're going to talk about sort of your interests and what happened in your life to lead you to education research. If you have had any obstacles that you overcame, if you're from an underrepresented background, all of those things can play a role in your personal statement. Anything that brought you to the work, you want to put in there. And anything that makes your voice as a researcher unique, you want to put in there. And again, just like your research statement is the time to show that you have the skills and the research chops, and your personal statement is, it's your narrative, it's the why you do what you do on a broader level.
So our last question is, now that you have the grant, what advice do you have for fellowship recipients who are sort of conducting more research that is like supervised in a way or funded, I guess?
Yeah. So every funding agency is going to have different requirements, but generally speaking, if they're funding you to do research, they're going to expect reports from you back on how it's going. So the Spencer, I think there were 2 sort of formal reports that I had to turn in about what my progress was so far. And then I had to turn something in again after my dissertation was finished. And so you're going to have to probably send in periodic reports. This is going to sound like strange advice, but I think it's good to think of them as like logistical requirements and not as enormous hurdles where you have to prove that you're amazing.
Sure.
You need to know that you're doing the work. Things can be changing, things can be messy, that's okay. You just have to show them that you're making progress. Like an interim report, for example, is not supposed to be everything is perfect and everything's going according to plan and everything is awesome and everything is almost done. Like, no, it's an interim report. It's supposed to say things are in progress, but yes, I have actually made progress since I started. So there'll be the number of times you have to check in is going to differ, but there would almost always be some kind of report that you have to submit to them that shows them, yes, I'm doing the work that you gave me money to do, and things are going fine, and things are progressing, and I promise I'll finish it.
Well, that's all the questions that I have from you. Do you have any other pieces of advice that you'd like to share with our graduate students?
Yeah, just don't be afraid to make use of your community. Ask people. I was very surprised when I applied for the Spencer how willing people were to meet with me and talking about the process or share materials with me. And like I said, I've had people email me who I have never met before about like, hey, you got a Spencer. Can I talk to you about that? And yes, the answer is yes. And again, just like even the process of applying is worthwhile and is a professional development experience. So just put yourself out there. The worst thing that can happen is that you get this good professional development experience. And the best thing that can happen is you get support for your research. So there's no downside to putting yourself out there.
Well, thank you so much. I think this was a meaningful interview, and I guess people will reach out to you now if they have questions about the Spencer. So
great.
Sorry for that.
That'll be great. We all love talking about research. We all love hearing about each other's research. That's part of it. Yeah.